Hello, everyone, and welcome back to day 2 of the Confronting Atrocity Conference, Narrating Transitional Justice. This conference is hosted by the Confronting Atrocity Project and the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster University with support from Illinois State University. We'll be starting our day today with our day 2 keynote address by Zakes Mda, titled A Storage Place of Memory, Misremembered Narratives of Reconciliation, Restoration, and Betrayal. Before we formally get started with an introduction of our keynote speaker by Dr. Paul Ugor, I'm going to briefly go over the ways you can view and participate in today's event. This information will also be posted in the chat momentarily for your reference. So there will be time for a Q&A session at the end of Dr. Mda's talk, so please feel free to use the chat feature to pose your questions for our keynote speaker throughout the presentation. Or if you would prefer to ask your question verbally at the end of the presentation, please let us know in the chat and we will ask you to unmute yourself when it's your turn to ask a question. As we have many wonderful attendees today, we also ask that during the presentation, you please turn off your video to ensure maximum bandwidth for everyone here today. And you may turn your video back on when asking questions during the Q&A. And just a reminder, this event is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice YouTube page. And with that, I will pass things over to Dr. Paul Ugor to formally introduce today's event and our wonderful speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. My name is Paul Ugor. I am a faculty member in the Department of English at Illinois State University and one of the conveners of this conference. On behalf of the director and the entire research team here at the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice at McMaster University, I welcome you to the second day of the International Conference on Narrating Transitional Justice. As you all know, the conference began yesterday, and we've already had a series of very fascinating presentations that have privileged really important insights into the strong links between narrativity and processes of national reconciliation, healing, and truth-seeking. So we hope to continue with those productive conversations today. Now, although the conference is entirely virtual, it is being hosted on-site from Hamilton, Ontario, the primary location of McMaster University. And anyone paying attention to events happening in Canada must have heard the stunning news of the discoveries of hundreds of unmarked graves of First Nations children in the grounds of former residential schools in 2 provinces here. This national saga is unfolding 13 years after the Canadian government apologized to Indigenous peoples for the horrific violence and abuse endured by their children in residential schools and the formal commencement of the National Program of Truth and Reconciliation in 2008. Now, Canada's CHRRJ report was released in 2015, but the recent revelations about unmarked graves of children who perished in residential schools in the country remind us that projects of national reconciliation are not finite. The search for truth and healing is always ongoing. Most importantly, these findings remind us that national reconciliation can never be effective purely as a state-led, top-down political process. As Riley Yesno, a queer Anishinaabe writer and public intellectual, puts it, quote, "The process of healing from centuries of genocide, marginalization, and injustice takes time, likely generations, and cannot be expedited to meet the timelines of any individuals, organizations, or government's vision of reconciliation," unquote. Instead, as Mary Seaman, the newly appointed Governor General of Canada, noted during her swearing-in ceremony on Monday this week, quote, "National reconciliation is a way of life and requires work every day." In other words, national reconciliation is as less purely political as it is as much a cultural process. You might legislate a nation into being, but you cannot decree a way of life, a culture into existence. This is perhaps why Homi Bhabha, that erudite scholar of post-colonial thought, argued that a nation is nothing but an exercise in metaphorization, in which state-making is more symbolic, rhetorical, mythological, and collective. Now, in making a case for the nation as a work of textuality, that is, a nation as a cultural product rather than a political idea or entity, Bhabha insisted that as a form of cultural elaboration, a nation is essentially, quote, an agency of ambivalent narration that holds culture at its most productive position as a force for subordination, fracturing, diffusing, reproducing as much as producing, creating, forcing, and guiding. So our conference could not have happened at a more opportune moment, because we're gathered here essentially to ponder on the place of narratology in various national contexts where there are ongoing efforts to forge a new national imaginary after years of brutal violence and exploitation of indigenous peoples and other vulnerable groups. But how do we propagate and nurture a new national consciousness that recognizes and approaches national reconciliation and healing as a way of life rather than as a political process? What is the role of cultural labor in this process of national reengineering? What is the function of metaphoricity in the formation of a truthful and reconcilable nation? Canada's new Governor General insists that, quote, reconciliation is getting to know one another. But how can we know one another if we do not tell each other our stories? In the epigraph to Thompson Highway's famous play, Dry Lips, he provides important insights into the poetics and purpose of his work, noting that, quote, before the healing can take place, the poison must first be exposed, unquote. How does representational work help to unmask or expose centuries of racial inequalities and systemic violence? In other words, centuries of poisonous contagions. These are some of the tough questions we're gathered here to critically meditate upon today. So I'm truly proud to be part of this event, and I look forward to another day of productive conversations around these issues and debates. Now, I wear two hats this morning. Apart from my opening remarks, I've been asked by the director of the center to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Zakes Mda. Professor Mda is not just a literary figure, a literary icon in the field of African letters, but a towering figure in the global literary scene. In fact, I must confess that his essay on fictions of reconciliation in South Africa provided the initial foundational ideas that inspired the entire conference. So it is truly an honor and privilege to be asked to introduce him. Professor Mda is a South African, Lesotho, Appalachian American and African writer, painter, filmmaker, and music composer. He holds an MFA in Theater Studies and an MA in Telecommunications from Ohio University and a PhD from the University of Cape Town. He has been awarded honorary doctorates in literature by the University of Cape Town, the University of Wits, and the University of Free State. In technology by the Central University of Technology, and in art by Dartmouth College and Durban University of Technology. He has published 25 books, 11 of which are novels, and the rest collections of plays, poetry, and a monograph on the theory and practice of theater for development. His paintings have been exhibited in South Africa, Lesotho, and the United States, and in collections in those countries and in Spain and Sweden. His writings have been translated into 22 languages, including Estonian, Catalan, Korean, Serbian, German, Swedish, Dutch, Turkish, Norwegian, and Italian. They have won many awards in South Africa, the United States, and Italy, including Amstel Playwright of the Year Award, the Commonwealth Writers Prize for Africa, the Mnet Prize. Twice has won the Salem Prize. He's also won the Pringle Award. Twice has won the Sunday Times Literary Prize. He's also won the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Legacy Award, the Premio Narrativa Sud del Mondo, the University of Johannesburg Literary Prize, and the American Library Association Notable Book. He is a recipient of Ikamanga Order in Silver, a national award of the South African government. Currently, he commutes between the United States, where he teaches creative writing at Johns Hopkins University and is a Professor Emeritus at Ohio University, and South Africa, where he is a beekeeper, a feature film producer with St. Francis Production, and a director of Neo Zane, which is an animation film production company. He's composed all of the music for The Bells of Amersfoort, his play produced by the New Amsterdam Theatre Group in the Netherlands, and for The Prels, an animation feature currently in production in Johannesburg. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege indeed to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Zakes Mda.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate at this important conference. And of course, Professor Ugo for the generous introduction. And the important quote that national reconciliation is a way of life and requires work every day. I think my presentation is closely related to that. My case study here for misremembered narratives of reconciliation, restoration, and betrayal is South Africa. As you know, there was a time in South Africa when the dominant discourse in society was reconciliation. This was during the 5 years of Nelson Mandela's presidency, tapering off a few years after his retirement from public office. It was trendy for most news and entertainment media to carry stories of reconciliation. It was taken as a given that reconciliation would automatically be followed by restoration, narrowed to restorative justice by others, an encounter that aimed to lead conflictive parties towards healing. On television, a real-life theater of reconciliation was unfolding. The actors were the victims and perpetrators of apartheid atrocities who narrated their stories at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The hearings were broadcast live as they toured the major cities of South Africa. Narratives of horror and forgiveness were repeated in special reports in all major print and electronic platforms. Prominent victims and sometimes perpetrators captured the imagination of the nation and were the subject of discussion in taxis, bars, and other spaces of public debate. Storytellers in general and verbal and performance artists in the particular case of this presentation, get the themes of their creative production from society. Whether they view themselves as mirrors or interpreters of society, they are informed by the prevailing discourse in society. They, in turn, may symbiotically inform the discourse in society or determine its direction, depending on how influential they are. Thus, reconciliation and restoration were leading themes in art during this period. The flurry of creativity was intensified by the fact that both state and non-governmental arts and education funding agencies favored that subject over all others. In my Gladstone lecture that Dr. Ugo mentioned on the fiction of reconciliation, I noted that these themes found expression in performing arts more than they did in literary arts because of the publisher's antipathy to stories set during apartheid. The prevailing wisdom in the industry was that people no longer wanted to read about apartheid. Memory did not sell books. And yet fiction, by its very nature, thrives on causality. It would be difficult to write a convincing story of reconciliation without portraying the conflictual past and the conditions that made the advocacy for reconciliation necessary. There was, however, some TRC-inspired fiction that garnered significant international attention. Most of it was by established authors who already had an international following and therefore would not be amenable to irrational gatekeeping. For instance, Jabulo Ndebele's The Cry of Winnie Mandela and J.M. Coetzee's Disgrace. I critically examined these works and others in that lecture. It was in theatrical spaces, both purpose-built conventional performance venues and makeshift popular ones, the so-called alternative theater, where memory was principally explored. Some of the plays were performed by professional actors and musicians, while others distinguished themselves by featuring the affected victims of apartheid atrocities themselves on stage, real-life TRC participants, or their personal testimonies enacted by actors, or a combination of both. An example of this was the story I am about to tell, produced by Bobby Rodwell, working with the Kulumani support group. Narratives of reconciliation and restoration tapered off over the years as the ruling elite shifted focus from healing the communities to governance, as if the two could not be achieved simultaneously. And then from governance to wanton self-aggrandizement and wealth accumulation. Today, reconciliation is no longer on the agenda, and restoration exists only as lip service or symbolic gestures, such as changing the names of streets and towns from those of the colonial masters to those of the heroes of the victorious political party in the struggle, or to the original pre-colonial place names. Stories continue to reflect and interpret the shifts as history marches on, and as ideological transformations are performed on the public square. By story here, I mean a series of motivated events linked by causality in whatever medium or channel or platform. Narrative, on the other hand, is the vehicle that carries the story. This is a definition from narratology. Thus, we can have many different narratives of the same story. And indeed, stories of reconciliation and restoration came in varied narratives, with each community shaping its own narrative to deal with its own trauma. By community here, of course, I'm talking of both community of interest and geographic community. Stories are a storehouse or perhaps a storage place of memory. And through them, the past continues to be a strong presence in the present. The broken promises of the TRC, particularly the grievance among the Black youth that no justice of any kind, not even the much vaunted restorative justice, was ever served, continue to be the past that haunts the present. Lind, 2015, notes that both narrative and memory are social processes that are constructed. She writes that, and I quote, "Memory and narrative describe ways that an individual or group represents a version of the past in the present, often for the purpose of shaping a desired future," end of quote. She continues elsewhere, and I quote again, "Memories of what is understood to be the same event change over time as the person changes and in response to the responses of audiences to the story," end of quote. Memory is therefore not stable. While I'm in this definitional mode, I use memory here to describe the act of remembering the past, what to be remembered and how it should be remembered. The past is never what it used to be. It is what we reimagine in the present. Often we modify the past to assuage the present or to legitimize it. We create the past anew every day as we remember it, dismember it, and misremember it. This was brought home to me when I was invited to the opening of Isivivana, a youth community center in the township of Khayelitsha in Cape Town on October 13th, 2016. After a workshop on storifying their lives, I sat on a chair surrounded by boys and girls ranging in age from 7 to 13, who were sitting on the pavement while they debated some aspects of storification. They were discussing a story by one of the writers of the Sophiatown Renaissance of the mid-1950s, and were quite disturbed by the way the apartheid system treated Black people as portrayed in the story. One of them declared that Nelson Mandela should be ashamed of himself for, and I quote, selling out the Black people to the Boers, end of quote. A conversation ensued, and all the kids agreed that Mandela was indeed a sellout. The man spent 27 years in prison, most of them on Robben Island. I said, how can he be a sellout? The kids dismissed the whole idea of him having spent all those years in prison with contempt. They said the man lived a comfortable life in a house with a swimming pool at the precinct of Victor Verster prison. What I found striking was that they all subscribed to that narrative and completed one another's sentences. There was not a single dissident. This was obviously a universal memory in their world. As I had posted, after I had posted this experience on Facebook, the renowned critical scholar, Professor David Atwell, commented that this was a tragic situation, and I quote, "It's easier for them to accept that narrative than to square up to the fact that the government has failed them," end of quote. Dr. Xoxeka Mfundisi, a neurosurgeon, commented, and I quote, "Maybe what they got out of the 27 years is how they measure the freedom fighter. They conclude that he must have been a sellout if this is the settlement he negotiated," end of quote. Were these children perhaps rewriting history? An observation made by Lind 2015 is apt here when she says, there is a crucial distinction between history and collective memory, in that collective memory does not preserve the past, but is a reconstruction of the past in the present as a result of ongoing collective activities. History, on the other hand, functions differently as it purports to present the best reconstruction of the truth of what actually happened. I must add that history is not impartial, despite the existence of rules in historiography governing evidence. The biases of selection and interpretation continue to reinforce the cliché that it is the story of the victor into a truism. The reconstruction of the Mandela narrative by the Black youth of Cape Town, who dismiss historical record as political propaganda devised by the ruling elite, is received with disdain by the older generation, whose memory of Mandela is informed by the fact that they were active participants in the remembered events during the man's lifetime. A manager of a jazz musician based in Cape Town, Kwezi Cobus, who is of the era of the liberation struggle, commented on another occasion on a Facebook post, and I quote, "It is a sad day when young parents teach their children that our well-celebrated icon, Madiba, and Madiba is Nelson Mandela, sold out his people." End of quote. Obviously, Cobus subscribes to Lynn's assertion on how children are socialized into producing socially acceptable narratives. She writes, and I quote, "This is done by adults scaffolding the children's discourse about past and present events during daily conversations," end of quote. Mandela's betrayal is obviously a regular conversation in the households of the township, to the extent that it has established the children's collective identity as Mandela's victims. In this way, remembering and misremembering are narrated into existence as a memory that contributes to identity formation. After I requested Cobus to expound on his disdain of young parents, he responded in another Facebook post, and I quote, "This is prevalent among young people who seem to be influenced by PAC, that's the Pan-Africanist Congress, or EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, propaganda. These are opposition parties in South Africa." One young man expressed this in a full hall at Kwalanga, a township in Cape Town, during a Mandela Day event. They justify themselves by pointing at youth unemployment, poverty, landlessness, and white dominance of the economy through capitulation at CODESA. CODESA, that is the Convention for a Democratic South Africa, where the new post-apartheid dispensation was negotiated. The quote continues. "I, for one, see this as a cop-out of entitlement by young people who feel everything must be served to them on a silver platter without any hard work on their part. A day ago, a young child said it on an Umhlobo Wenene FM, that's a radio station, program that asked what comes to mind on Mandela Day. She said, 'I think of someone who sold out his people.'" End of quote. I am quoting these statements to illustrate anecdotally the wide prevalence of opinion on the alleged Mandela betrayal and the memory that informs them. I've written about this sentiment over the years because it is not new. The historian and former principal of Green Templeton College, Oxford University, Colin Bundy, 2019, writes that Mandela's obituaries were, and I quote, "welling with rhetorical excess and hyperbole," end of quote. And mentions that I was the exception because in an obituary, I presciently noted the existence of an increasingly vocal segment of young Black South Africans who claimed that Mandela sold out the liberation struggle to white interests. At the time I wrote this, in 2013, the Blame Mandela movement was not yet a groundswell. Bundy 2019 notes that such views rapidly won traction. He writes, and I quote, "By 2015, a reputation that had appeared inviolable was being called shrilly into question in South Africa, in the media, on the airwaves, on the streets, and especially on campuses across the country. Members of non-ANC Black intelligentsia and swaths of disaffected born-frees generated a counter-narrative hostile to the 1994 negotiated settlement and accusing Mandela of authoring a historic betrayal." Yvette Hardy, a theater maker who focuses on storytelling projects for young people that speak to the core of what it means to be human, works with storytellers from all over Africa. Truth in Translation, a play she produced in 2006 that explored the trauma of the translators of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission hearings, who had to use first-person I in their interpretations during the proceedings, vicariously becoming victims and perpetrators in turn, was performed in Rwanda, a society that has experimented with various forms of justice, including the Gashasha, restorative justice, and the classical retributive type. She contends that reconciliation is, and I quote, "a tainted word." Her productions go to communities to start the conversation. And she says, in any group of young people, there will be a good number of them who believe Mandela was a sellout. The reason often given is that nothing changed for Black people. I quote, "We were sold this concept of democracy, but nothing has come out of it. White people still run the economy. There should have been a proper revolution. Mandela is a global icon, especially for white people. Mandela is a hero of the whites." End of quote. Another theater maker, Rodwell 2021, believes that reconciliation has always been tainted. I quote, "It has been shoved down the throats of youth without the chance to unpack the history. They are just informed that this liberal concept of reconciliation is a good thing. There's always been disgruntlement that reconciliation seemed to be a Black issue, a Black problem. It was the victim of apartheid who was out there searching for a solution, looking for people to forgive, people who never asked for forgiveness. It was for Mandela to visit Betsy Verwoerd, that's the wife of the architect of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, and sue for peace, not the other way around. The perpetrators or the perpetrator had washed his hands of everything and was moving on with his life as if nothing had happened, enjoying the new opportunities of an economy opened up by the new political order. Reconciliation was the vocabulary of the victim and a handful of white progressives and liberals, but never of the perpetrator. Perhaps at this point, I must mention that the collective memory that I share with some of my peers, a generation that was born 5 decades before the demise of apartheid, and therefore participated in the liberation struggle, including the armed struggle, is different. We do not remember Mandela as a sellout. He was a flawed human being and was the first one to confess that he was not a saint. Over the years, even when he was president, I have criticized him for some of his commissions and omissions, such as his unquestioning loyalty to his comrades, resulting in the nascent corruption that has since become unmanageable. For example, when one of his comrades, Ms. Baleka Mbete, then Deputy Speaker of the National Assembly of South Africa, and later Deputy President of the country, was exposed by investigative journalists for receiving a driver's license fraudulently without taking the test, Mandela immediately came to her defense, calling her a woman of integrity, without examining the evidence against her. It was the beginning of what became the tradition of the ruling African National Congress of closing ranks around corrupt comrades and of the emergence of the culture of impunity that we see today. Another imperfection of his that contributed to the culture of corruption in the ruling party was his relentless accumulation of wealth. It all started innocently enough when, after his release from prison, sympathizers around the world collected money as gifts to this icon who had suffered for 27 years in prison, but came out talking forgiveness and reconciliation. These millions found their way into his various trusts. His book, Long Walk to Freedom, raked in further millions of dollars, and then later, he became some kind of an artist, selling his naive paintings online all over the world, and later, even his handprint. Soon he was a wealthy man, and his comrades eyed him with envy. The liberation struggle was becoming profitable to this man because he was an icon. His comrades, hardened freedom fighters, were not icons, and no one donated millions to them. So they sold access and took bribes. Others looted the coffers of the state. Those who were caught out were protected by the ruling party, including by him. He was loyal to his comrades to a fault. Granted, he rallied the local business community to build schools and contributed funds to some of the projects. He was also generous to his comrades and shared some of his wealth with them. When Jacob Zuma, then a provincial cabinet minister, with an economics portfolio, and later a deputy president and president, was living above his means and drowning in debt, Mandela rescued him with a gift of 1 million rands, Smith 2012. 4 years after his death, we learned from the Panama Papers of his millions that were languishing in offshore accounts. So yes, the man was not perfect, but selling out was not one of his flaws. The negotiations for the new order were multi-party. He was not the sole negotiator. His party had not won freedom through a revolution, but negotiations. You don't get everything you want in a negotiation. The parties took the best deal they could get under the circumstances. Those who followed him were left to complete the unfinished business. They did not, because they were focusing on eating in quotes, a colloquialism for accumulating wealth through corruption. For Khaya Ludla, a chartered accountant and former partner at Ernst & Young, the pother lies with his compatriots' culture of entitlement. And I quote him here: "The problem with Madiba's, that is Mandela, Madiba's legacy is not him. The problem is with those who felt entitled to grab his legacy and use it against us, because data, and data of course is a term of endearment for Mandela, because Tata has forgiven. He did what he could with what he had." This is the collective memory of some of us, which does not tally with the collective memory of the Black youth. Once more, the refrain stands: we transfigure the past to palliate the present. The rejection of the collective memory of the euphoric New South Africa as a misremembered past has occasioned the creation of a new collective memory that bolsters the readopted identity of victimhood. The bulk of human rights literature uses victim and survivor interchangeably. Mamdani 2015 is one of the few scholars in this area who makes a distinction between the two concepts when he argues for the inclusive political justice as against the zero-sum logic of criminal justice. He views the latter as victim justice and the former as survivors justice, victims justice as against survivors justice. The transition from victim to survivor is a conscious act that takes a deliberate effort to accomplish. Some may be dismissive of the victim-survivor typification as something informed by pop psychology. In fact, it has its origins from clinical practice in the treatment of trauma. Clinicians map out the healing journey as a continuum from the condition of victimization to survival and finally thriving. Victims feel helpless, whereas survivors have reclaimed their power and taken back the control of their lives. A clinical psychologist, Dillman, writes, and I quote, "An individual in the victim stage feels as though he or she is still in the trauma, no matter how long ago the actual traumatic incident occurred. The sense of being in that moment of time permeates the person's feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and even his or her sense of self. It is common for an individual in this stage to avoid many emotions while experiencing in abundance feelings of helplessness, vulnerability, fragility, self-pity, numbness, defeat, shame, self-hatred, and discouragement." End of quote. Apartheid was a very violent system and affected every South African to varying degrees, of course. Not only the stars of apartheid is in quotes, of course, as Magona 2021 calls those who were imprisoned or tortured in prominent ways. The ordinary Black people going through their daily lives went through the trauma, and that trauma is intergenerational. The movement from victimhood to survivorship would have been achieved with programs aimed exactly at bringing about that transition. In the same way that the vocabulary and therefore the need for reconciliation permeated the educational system and civil society, using, among other tools, verbal and performing arts. The same should have been done for this healing process. In other words, the campaign should not only have ended with reconciliation, it should have proceeded, to healing, to restoration, and to healing. Another trauma specialist, Kozlowski, 2019, comments on the helplessness of victims compared with survivors who, by the very act of surviving, have reclaimed their power and taken back the control of their lives. Survivorship forces one to take responsibility for one's choices and one's feelings. This is followed by the conscious decision that one is no longer a victim. Tedeschi underlines the importance of storification in survivorship when he notes that stories may produce social transformation even on those who did not directly experience the trauma. Here I'm thinking of South Africa's Born Frees, who did not personally experience apartheid state violence, but suffer from its trauma nonetheless. In the same way that traumatization may be vicarious, post-traumatic growth may be vicarious as well. Tedeschi adds, those experiencing vicarious post-traumatic growth may then be enlisted in the struggle for social change as their consciousness has been raised through the witnessing of the survivors. End of quote. Hardly in her practice as theater director who has storified reconciliation from the early stages of the TRC process to its aftermath, does focus on programs that empower young people to deal with their trauma. Though they don't use the victim survivor typification, they talk of empowering their participants with agency and resilience. They aim to equip young people with imagination to envision future scenarios rather than be defined by what happened in the past. This is what programs that aim to transition victims into survivors do. Victim consciousness does not equip one with a sense of personal responsibility. Instead, it makes victims resort to conspiracy theories which are inherently without benefit of evidence. Conspiracy theories are the staple of many South Africans today, as the Black youth search in vain for the source of their problems. The ones who submit, therefore, provide. The ones who must then, therefore, provide the solution. In the absence of programs to transform victims into survivors and then into active citizens building their broken communities, the majority of South Africans are stuck with victim consciousness 27 years after the demise of apartheid. It is a new identity, a readopted identity, a reversion to the victimhood of decades ago when they had, which they had overcome. The change from the politics of protest to the politics of challenge and resistance was mirrored in the shift that happened in the production and enjoyment of the arts in the country. For decades, the verbal, performing, and visual arts in South Africa were characterized by protest. In one of my articles, Mda 1996, I make a distinction between protest theater and a theater of resistance. And allow me to quote myself here. Not all political theater is protest theater. Least of all, agitprop cannot be protest. That would be a contradiction in terms. Protest theater makes a statement of disapproval or disagreement, but does not go beyond that. It addresses itself to the oppressor with a view of appealing to his conscience. It is a theater of complaint or sometimes of weeping. It is vicariously a theater of self-pity, of moralizing, of mourning, and of hopelessness. It never offers any solution beyond the depiction of the sad situation in which the people find themselves. In short, protest theater was a theater of victims, as was protest politics. This was typified by works of playwrights like Gibson Kente, Sam Wangani, Boyki, Mushlamme, and Athol Fugard, except in those plays he created jointly with with John Carney and with Winston Chawner. I do elaborate on my analysis of that, you know, in that article. Theater for resistance, on the other hand, no longer wanted to address itself to the oppressor, but appealed to the oppressed. That was its primary audience, the oppressed, with a view of sharing new insights about the nature of oppression and rallying the oppressed to fight against oppression. It was informed by and in turn informed the militant politics of challenge and of confrontation. It was a theater of survivors rather than of victims. It began with a play titled "Give Us This Day" by Mzwandile Maqhina, and things were never the same again. This is how I characterize the era in the same article. I quote again, "Some theater practitioners in South Africa went beyond protest, a position which began with the advent of the Black consciousness movement in the 1970s. The case against protest theater was that by its nature, it attempted to reveal the Blacks to the whites and placed the onus on the Blacks to prove their humanity. The theater practitioner was no longer interested in creating a theater of complaint. The position gained momentum in the 1980s. It is during this period that the theater of resistance, which was distinct from protest theater, gained mass following and became the main genre, with practitioners from all ideological leanings in the South African liberation politics spectrum. Why didn't we draw from this experience in the post-apartheid era? The oppressed wouldn't have been victorious over apartheid if they had not cultivated the survivor mentality, you know, through this movement from victim to protest, from theater of protest to theater of resistance. Why are we now failing to survive freedom? How did we lose sight of structural violence that continues unabated, while in our carnivalesque we focused on individual stars of apartheid, as Magona calls them? Hardy believes that we got complacent. She says, and I quote, "We dropped the ball. We thought people had moved on. We have not done anything that speaks of restorative justice. The TRC was so badly let down by our government. For instance, there were no reparations, or the little that was there was badly managed. People who did not get amnesty were not taken to task." Tedeschi makes a useful observation that it is not only individuals who must recover from trauma, but communities and societies. He adds that social transformations occur when survivors narrate their experiences and take actions that create critical awareness in others, that obtain justice, and that prevent recurrences of similar events. In the meantime, people seek other solutions that range from the practical to magical thinking. Some of the victims in a quest for healing and in a quest to heal and become survivors, have tried to mend their brokenness by seeking redress in South African and United States courts of law. For instance, Khulumani Group, Khulumani Support Group has done exactly that without the support and in fact with active opposition of the South African government. Others look to prosperity gospel and denominations where they have to eat grass and drink insecticides and gasoline in order to attract divine relief from their condition of poverty. Some mine fool's gold in the form of crystal mistaken for diamond, or celebrate non-existent decuplets manufactured by the rich imagination of a mainstream newspaper editor in search of a scoop, or put faith in trillions of dollars that will make every South African rich, courtesy of a former cabinet minister who is a billionaire in his own right, and who claims, without presenting any evidence, that such funds to solve all South Africa's financial problems were donated by a trillionaire in Southeast Asia, known only as White Spiritual Boy. And we're now missing in the, at the South African Reserve Bank. There's never any fulfillment from magical thinking, only disillusionment that is then followed by a rupture, looting, and the banning of infrastructure that creates more victims. And the vicious cycle continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mda, for that excellent, well thought out and stimulating presentation. Your talk certainly challenges us to rethink some of our sort of conventional approaches to notions of national reconciliation and healing. So thank you so, so much. We have just about 5 minutes left for the Q&A.
Oh my goodness, I took all the time. I'm sorry.
Not a problem at all. We're happy with it. It's fine.
Oh dear.
Yes, I see we have questions already on the chat function. I'd like to take the question posed by Professor Shane Graham, that I'm sure you know very well is an important voice in this discourse of literature and reconciliation. And his question is this, 1 second, I need to scroll back up because questions are popping in. And okay, so this is from Shane Graham. As someone who writes both plays and novels, could Professor Mda discuss the merits of its genre for facilitating vicarious post-traumatic growth in the reader or audience?
Well, you know, I'll try to be very short because I grabbed all the time already. And for me, of course, who writes, as you rightly point out, both novels and plays, there are different target audiences, you know, for the two. And I don't think I'm the only one. I think other people in South Africa as well find theater much more effective, because through theater, we communicate directly with the audience. And you are able to take the production to different venues and to create dialogue, because these are not plays, you know, where they end with the performance. But after the performance, there is always discussion on the issues. That's where you get to hear how people are disillusioned with the new order and with Nelson Mandela and so on and so forth. It is from such discussions, you see. So I think that theater becomes much more effective. Novels also do serve their function for a different kind of audience, a much more literate audience, an audience that would go for that medium. Because principally, we write, or let me say, I write for entertainment. That's the main objective. And of course, whatever else that flows from there. People read my novels in order to enjoy. And then perhaps if there's information and anything else that flows from that, that is the bonus. That's a different audience, that one.
Okay, we can take one more. Let's see, this one is by Emmanuel Neyonkuru. I hope I pronounced that well. So my question to Professor Mda is okay, I'm just going to try and rephrase that. Is the unequal allocation of resources among South African natives and the whites the triggering factor for delaying reconciliation and the continuity of xenophobia in South Africa?
Well, xenophobia, of course, which is something that's part of the things that I'm talking about here. The disillusionment with their own government, their own situation, where then they have to find a scapegoat. And who is best to scapegoat if not people from outside of South Africa? And you find that this happens a lot. It is not something that you find across all classes, that there's xenophobia across all classes. It is something that you find amongst the most marginalized of communities. And you'll find that the foreigners who are at the receiving end are those who are accessible to those marginalized communities. Maybe because they trade amongst the marginalized communities, or they live amongst those marginalized communities, and therefore they become the scapegoat. Many of them who trade in the marginalized community actually are job creators in those communities. You see, I mean the so-called foreigners. But then they are on the receiving end of this. That is why in South Africa, you'll find that there are big campaigns from other people, people like us and others, against xenophobia. Some of the theater makers I was telling you about here, even as I speak, have plays that are touring South Africa, different communities, against xenophobia. Others have the so-called foreigners themselves as actors in those plays, telling their own stories. You see, maybe I should, if I had time, I would have mentioned some of those plays as well. Why? Because that's part of the whole process of healing that is not happening that much in South Africa. Hence, we find now, these attitudes that I'm talking about here.
Okay, we want to give the conference participants a couple of minutes to go, get some coffee and washroom before they move to the panel presentations. So we would just thank Professor Mda for his presentation. I absolutely enjoyed listening to your presentation this morning.
Thank you so much.
And I'm glad that we persisted in tracking you down, because it took a while to get you to come to doing a presentation for us. So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I see people already asking questions about when we would upload your presentation online. We will be doing that in the next couple of days, so don't worry about it. You will.
I'll also send you this paper.
Okay, please do.
If that's what you want.
Yes, thank you so much. So on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice and all the participants at the conference, I thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.